Good evening, and thank you for tuning in. My name is Claire McElroy, and I am on the Whatcom Reads Steering Committee. Whatcom Reads is our annual all-county book discussion that has been happening since 2009. It's a partnership between all public and academic libraries in Whatcom County and our community partner, Village Books. In 2026, we're reading and discussing Solito, a memoir. This is Javier Zamora's memoir about his harrowing journey at 9 years old from El Salvador to the U.S.-Mexico border. Javier Zamora will be in Whatcom County for two public events on March 12th and 13th. And between now and March 12th, there is a robust and varied schedule of events like today's that are related to the themes of Solito. Saff Killingsworth is a biologist based in Tucson, Arizona. She works primarily on the conservation of plants and their pollinators through her current work with the Xerces Society for Invertebrate Conservation and her previous work as a freelance botanist and with the Tucson Bird Alliance and the National Park Service. She also participates in local humanitarian aid effort to end death and suffering in the borderlands. She envisions a future where we all have a better understanding of and more regard for the little creatures that make the world go round. I love that. In her spare time, she enjoys gardening, cooking, hiking, and searching for elusive desert swimming holes. All right, so wherever you are in your home, give a warm welcome to Saff Killingsworth.
Hello, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm so happy to be here with you all tonight to talk about the Sonoran Desert. And yeah, like Claire said, I am a biologist based in Tucson, Arizona, and I've worn a lot of different hats. And tonight I'm wearing the hat of just an individual biologist. I'm not here representing any particular group, but I have a lot of experience to draw on in the biology world and in the humanitarian aid world. So I'm happy to merge those topics together. We're going to start with a little introduction to the Sonoran Desert and some of the factors that make this place so diverse. And then we're going to move into how those the biological conditions here interact with policy to make this place so dangerous for migrants to cross. So I know that some of you may have attended a policy discussion and presentation a couple weeks ago. There may be some overlapping topics there, and I'm excited to see what comes of it. So thank you so much for having me. Okay. Before we get into the Sonoran Desert, I wanted to give you all a lightning quick introduction to deserts in general. In North America, we have four major deserts. That's the Great Basin Desert, the Mojave Desert, the Chihuahuan Desert, and my personal favorite, the Sonoran Desert. And I think most of us have like an intuitive sense of what a desert is. Like it's hot, it's dry, maybe it's both of those at the same time. But sort of the best non-technical way to describe a desert is an area where water is severely limiting to life most of the time. So maybe it rains a lot, or like a fair amount, but there is a lot of pressure in terms of like evapotranspiration, and that contributes to stress to the organisms that live there. So that's just the basic overview of what a desert is. And then I'm going to give you a really quick tour of the three other deserts before we do the deep dive into the Sonoran Desert. So the first one is the Great Basin Desert. This is a high elevation desert that is a shrub steppe ecosystem. It has sort of medium hot summers and cold winters where most precipitation falls as snow, and there's no direct water outlet to this region. And that contributes to some of the features you're seeing in this image. I meant to check to see if you could see my mouse, but if you can, I am running it over this sort of flat playa-like area on the slide. And that is an area that's created in part due to this lack of a direct water outlet. So that's what the Great Basin Desert looks like. Here's another image of that same desert. In the foreground, we have sagebrush and then this open expanse behind it, and then mountains in the background. The next desert that I'll talk about is the Mojave Desert. This is the driest of our four deserts, and most rain falls in the winter. And it's very hot in the summer. There's low vegetation cover overall, and most of that vegetation is short-statured. It's very rocky. And if you're familiar with the Joshua tree, that is an enigmatic species of this area and is an indicator species of the Mojave Desert. Here's one more image of that desert. You can see in the foreground, we have some, well, throughout the whole photo, you see like low stature vegetation, some yucca, quite rocky. So those are the features of the Mojave. And then we have the Chihuahuan Desert. And this is a desert where most of the rain falls in the summer from monsoon moisture. The summers are like medium, hot, less hot. They're not as hot as the Mojave or the Sonoran Desert, and winters are pretty cool. Those climatic conditions contribute to generally low, few trees in the lowland. So this desert's pretty grassy. You can see like a lot of grass cover, not a lot of trees. And you see the same thing in this image here of the Chihuahuan Desert. And now we arrive at the best desert, in my opinion, the Sonoran Desert, and the one that is featured so prominently in Solito and that has brought us all here tonight for this talk. This desert is about 100,000 square miles in southern Arizona and parts of northern Mexico, the Baja Peninsula and the mainland. And it's visually distinct from the other deserts because it has these large columnar cacti and leguminous trees. So they're pretty small shrubby trees. For you all in the Northwest, calling it a tree is maybe a stretch, but for us, it's the best we got in the lowlands. So in this image, I'm hovering my mouse again on a couple different columnar cacti. If you're able to see, we have the iconic saguaro cactus here. And then sort of in the center of this picture, there's a couple individuals of the organ pipe cactus. And those are just two of our 4 columnar cacti that you can find in the Sonoran Desert. And this desert's also different because the winters are mild. So I'm joining you today from a day in February that was about 70 degrees, not to brag. And it's that mild winter also that allows for columnar cacti to exist here. So these cacti are giant water storage organisms. And if you can imagine like consistent freezing temperatures would mean that these whole things would freeze solid. The cell walls of this plant would burst and you'd basically have a pile of plant slop. So in other deserts that are cold, you can't have this kind of columnar cacti. We are an arid subtropical desert, and we have the reputation as the most tropical desert out of the 4. And you really see that influence when we have good rainfall, and I'll talk about that a little bit more later in the presentation. So I probably don't have to tell you that the desert is very hot. We have temperatures in the summer in the triple digits pretty regularly. And the most challenging part of summer for me personally is that our nighttime lows are still quite hot. So like around 80 degrees, which I know for you all is like a hot summer day. That's as cool as it gets in the summer, which can be kind of tricky, kind of hard to go out. But we have very mild winters and frosts are rare. So you see on the sides of this graph, you see January and December at the far edges of this graph where we have temperatures usually between 40 and 70. In this region, we also have an interesting rain pattern, a little different than what you might expect. We have a bimodal precipitation pattern, which means we have about 3 to 12 inches of rain that fall here that come just about equally in 2 different seasons. So we have our winter rain, and then we have monsoon season where we have larger rainfall events. And these 2 distinct rainfall seasons contribute to 2 distinct pulses of biological activity. So the plants and the pollinators that come out as a response to winter rain are largely different from the organisms that we have come out in response to a summer rain. And that contributes to exceptionally high biodiversity in this desert. So this is an image of a winter rain response. This photo was taken in the springtime, and this is probably a result of a pretty good rain year. We don't have quite such a beautiful bloom every year. But what you see in the foreground here is a big bloom of native annual wildflowers, including the orange is the Mexican poppy, and in the foreground is the owl's clover, the purple, the pink purple. So a giant pulse of annual wildflowers. And then we have monsoon season response. And so on the left-hand side of this slide, you see an image taken probably in June. If you look at the tops of each of those arms of the saguaro, you might be able to see a little bit of red color. And that is the split open saguaro fruits that ripen around June. They're highly prized by animals and people alike. And that's how I'm guessing that this photo was taken in June. And then just a few months later, after some good rain on the right, maybe this photo is taken in August. I'm just guessing there, but we see the monsoon response. So many of these drought deciduous trees have leafed out, and then we have a contiguous carpet of native, probably annual wildflowers all in between. Another factor that contributes to the incredible biodiversity in this area is our geology. So we are the geologic phenomenon that is where Tucson is, and most of the Intermountain West is characterized as basin and range. So this isn't unique to the Sonoran Desert, but it's part of what makes the Sonoran Desert special. Note that I'm showing you a picture of Nevada, which is where this phenomenon is especially well observed. So basin and range is this geologic phenomenon where about 40 to 20 million years ago, the entire Intermountain West was dominated by volcanic action. So sometimes that was large explosions with lava flows, sometimes that was ash flows, and all of that contributed to like all this mountain building. And at that time, because of the heat emanating from the Earth's core, the lower continental layer of the Earth was melted into this viscous goo, kind of the consistency of cold molasses. And then, about 25 to 8 million years ago, the Pacific coast of our continent adhered to the Pacific tectonic plate, and that plate began to pull westward, like away from the continent, stretching out this molasses layer and pulling apart all of these mountain ranges that had formed due to volcanic activity. So what you see here in this image is all of these areas labeled range were once contiguous mountain area, and then with the stretching of the molasses layer, we have these basins being formed that you can think of as kind of like the stretch marks of the Earth's crust. And we see that kind of geology here in southern Arizona as well. So I'm showing you on this page a map of southeast Arizona, southwest New Mexico, and northern Mexico. And the areas that are highlighted green here are high elevation mountainous areas. And below and in between that, where it's brown, is lowland desert. And so these mountain ranges form what we call the Sky Islands. These are mountainous areas that are separated by lowland desert, and that makes them isolated ecological communities. And because they're isolated, they become interesting stories of evolution. So a couple of different evolutionary things can happen in these Sky Islands. One of those is endemism. And that is where a single mountain range hosts a unique species that's found nowhere else. And then we also have relic populations. So that happens when, like, long ago, when the climate regime of this area was different and it was cooler and wetter, a species like the tree, the quaking aspen, was common at the lowland areas. And then when the climate became hotter and drier over time, thousands of years ago, that tree migrated up in elevation because that was the only suitable habitat, like climate band for that species to still occur in. So today we have in some of these mountain ranges, these little refugia of populations of organisms that could not persist on the desert floor, but are able to persist in some of these little ecological niches in the Sky Islands. And then I just also wanted to highlight altitudinal migration, which kind of overlaps with this relic population idea. And this is especially important to think about for me as a conservation biologist in a world where climate change is very real and impacting the biodiversity in all kinds of ecosystems. And this is when a species has a specific climate requirements, and with the changes happening because of climate change, those species are forced to move up in elevation to a more mountainous area so that they can have their needs met. And of course, this becomes a problem for species that are specialists already at the mountaintop. So there's like really no more up for those species to go under climate change scenarios. On these Sky Islands, we have different biological communities at different elevations. So we start sort of at about 2,000 feet where I live in Tucson, Arizona, with this typical desert ecosystem. And as we move up the mountain, we move through a number of different plant biomes, including a desert grassland, oak woodland, pine oak woodland, pine forest, and all the way at the top is your friend and neighbor in the Pacific Northwest, the Douglas fir. So I think it's very cool that we have such a diversity of plants, and they are distributed along these mountaintops that you can traverse in a single day. So there's a mountain range outside of Arizona, the Catalina Mountains, that has a highway all the way to the top where you can drive through and experience all these bioregions in just one day. One of these mountain ranges, these Sky Island mountain ranges, is called the Babakivari Range. And center to this range is Babakivari Peak, which is what I think that Javier Zamora is referring to in Solito when he talks about the rhino horn. So if you remember mentioning that while he's moving through the Sonoran Desert. This is an iconic and easily recognized peak that's used by many to navigate in the desert today, migrants and outdoor enthusiasts alike. This peak also has an interesting place in indigenous cosmology. So the tribal nation that occurs in this area is called the Tohono O'odham. And for that tribe, this is their origin story. The center of their universe is this peak. I just wanted to show you a couple other images of what Sky Islands can look like. So I'm showing you a picture from the Santa Rita Mountains. I took this picture probably between 6,000 and 7,000 feet. And this little inset map shows a star for where Tucson is located. And then this little arrow points to where the mountain range is. And when I look at this picture as a biologist, what I see is a lot of little environmental niches for a lot of different critters to live in. So I see a lot of different aspects and elevations and potential for little climate pockets that can help contribute to incredibly high biodiversity. And that goes for this image as well. This is of the Chiricahua Mountains. And this picture is taken between 5,000 and 6,000 feet. And again, this little inset has Tucson marked with a star and an arrow for where the Chiricahua Mountains are. This whole region has a rich indigenous history. The region has long been occupied by many different indigenous groups. And these are largely unceded territories, or in certain cases, the historical record is that some of these lands were ceded under duress. And what you notice when you look at this map, or what I notice, is that these regions do not align with our current concept of national or state boundaries. And I'll talk about that a little bit more a couple slides ahead. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to talk mostly about the Tohono O'odham tribal group that is indicated by sort of the red circle in the center of this range. And somewhere kind of in the middle of that circle is where Tucson is. The traditional lands of the Tohono O'odham are the longest continuously cultivated lands in the United States, and they include the oldest canal irrigated land. So I think this really flies in the face of some of our common concepts of what deserts are like, that they're like really inhospitable and nothing can live there. And they, that you couldn't possibly have like a rich cultural tradition here. And we know that's not true. These are the longest continuously cultivated lands in the US. And it's the rich agricultural traditions of these people that also contribute to local agricultural biodiversity. So I'm showing you on this slide a picture of the wild tepary bean. This is a native plant that grows in the area that's been stewarded by the Tohono O'odham and other tribes for thousands of years as a crop plant. And this crop plant is one of the most drought tolerant crops in the world. I've grown it in my backyard garden, and it's one of these unique cases where like the more you water it, the worse it produces. So it's a very interesting and very important traditional food for people in the area to this day. The Tohono O'odham Reservation abuts the US-Mexico border, but does not cross it, even though traditional territory did. So this red polygon is where the reservation is. Tribal members historically traveled back and forth across the US border. So this is a case where like the US border crossed the people and the people didn't cross the border. And traditionally, people cross the border to participate in cultural and religious events and to attend other practices. And this nation has consistently opposed the construction of border wall in the area. This tribe living in close proximity to a militarized border comes with some ongoing colonial violence that happens there. So that includes Border Patrol members running Tohono O'odham tribal members off the road in their vehicles. It includes the need to consistently advocate for contiguous historic lands without a border wall to divide it. And as recently as last year, Border Patrol shot and killed a Tohono O'odham man who had called Border Patrol asking for assistance. Tribal members are routinely harassed by Border Patrol on their own land because of racial profiling, and we see that evidenced here in this quote from Tohono O'odham member Annette Mattia talking to a CNN reporter. She says, "If you decide to go out in the mountains for the day, if you want to pick cactus fruit or get materials from the desert, Border Patrol will be out there and they will be on you. What are you doing here? Why are you out here?" So I've just talked you through a number of different factors that contribute to such high biological diversity here in the Sonoran Desert. And that includes extreme conditions like extreme heat, which sort of requires innovations and evolution among the organisms that live here. We have this bimodal rain pattern and the two distinct biological pulses in response to that. We have lots of topographical variation from the basin range formation, and then we have a long history of indigenous land stewardship. And now I'm going to walk you through a quick tour of some of the amazing biodiversity we have here. And I have to say, this was like one of the harder presentations to put together because there's so much to choose from. It was hard to narrow it down. So just know that I'm just scratching the surface here. Here in the Sonoran Desert, we have a huge biodiversity of birds that includes over 350 species. We have some really unique and emblematic birds. We have a number of species found nowhere else in the United States, and you can see over a dozen hummingbirds here in the area. So this picture is from left to right, the Lucifer, the broad-billed, and the Anna's hummingbird. And then here we have two of my favorite common lowland birds that are pretty emblematic of the Sonoran Desert. We have the greater roadrunner that's pictured here with a caterpillar in its bill, and then the Gambel's quail, which is my personal favorite in the area. And then we have the one of the species that is found nowhere else in the US. This is called the elegant trogon, and its northernmost extension of its range is in the Sonoran Desert. So you can see that it has mostly a Mesoamerican distribution and just barely makes it up into southeast Arizona. And because of that, it's a highly prized observation by birders. That, and it is just a uniquely beautiful bird as well. We also have this incredible diversity of plants with over 2,000 species. And to be a plant here, and really to be any other organism here, you have to have adaptations for heat and aridity tolerances. And so for our plants, those include succulents like this saguaro cactus in full bloom pictured here. You might one of those adaptations could be roots that go deep, deep, deep into the water table. There can be drought deciduous plants that lose their leaves in the hottest months because they're sort of a water loss liability. You can have really, really small leaves to minimize evaporation. You could have hairy leaves to try to, grow your own sunscreen or grow your own tiny microclimate above your leaf surface. Waxy leaves, so that's like for making an occlusive barrier so that you lose less water through your skin. And leaf orientation is another one. So if you imagine what a prickly pear looks like with cactus pads, those are mostly oriented up and down, so they receive much less direct sun contact. And then lastly, spines. And so spines can both protect against extraordinarily high herbivory pressure, and they can also act kind of as a sunscreen or a climate moderator right close to the plant tissue. Speaking of spines, I have put together this slide on what I think that Javier Zamora is referring to when he talks about the spikies and the fuzzies. So if you remember in the book, he talks about the plant life he encounters as he's crossing through the Sonoran Desert. And I have on the left side what I think are the spikies. So these are yuccas and agaves. And shown here on the top left of this slide is a plant called the shin dagger. And it truly lives up to its name. It is a shin-high agave species that's very rigid and very spiny. And walking through this is almost certain to draw blood. So not something you want to encounter or walk through. And on the right-hand side of this slide, I have what I think are the fuzzies. So these are a couple different species of cholla cactus. The top cholla on the top right here is referred to as the jumping cholla. And it's called that because it is so common to be out walking around and find that a segment of this cactus has detached and has now stuck itself to you, either directly to your skin, which is so painful, or to your clothing. And when I work in the field as a biologist, one of my required tools for the backcountry is a pair of kitchen tongs, which allows me to pull one of these segments off my body in the event that it gets stuck. And then you do some of the finer work with tweezers or pliers. So both of these categories of plants that Javier Zamora has highlighted for us really indicate like the treachery of the plant life here. This is also the plant that I think that Javier is referring to when he talks about the cheerleader bush. So he mentions this a couple times as he's moving through the desert with these cheery flowers that give you the sense that they're rooting for you, which I totally agree with. I think that that's such a great description of this. This is a species of acacia. And what you can't see very well pictured in this image is the really aggressive spines that also adorn this plant. And so even sort of the most cheery plants also come armed in this region. This last slide on plants features the chiltepin. And this is a wild relative of the domestic Capsicum annuum pepper. This is a species you can find out in the wilderness in this region, and it is featured in Solito when Javier is along the border waiting to cross into the US. That one of the houses he visits and stays at for a while that has some of the adults in that scene are crushing up this pepper and putting it on their food. This is still an important crop in Sonora, and these peppers are really spicy for how small they are. So they're like the size of a pea, and it just takes like 3 to 5 of these peppers to season a whole pot of beans. Um, on the bottom right here is a chiltepin grinder. So in this area, there's a whole culture of handicrafts dedicated to grinding this really important pepper. And so this is a tiny little pepper grinder where I think that the pestle is probably the size of your finger and the opening there is probably like the size of a quarter. And in the background there, you can see a chiltepin grinder that's fashioned after a jalapeno. This region also hosts a really high diversity of butterflies. We have over 250 species in the Sonoran Desert, and that's probably due to, in part, these two distinct biological pulses of precipitation, and then the following plant response. So I've just included a couple of my favorite species of butterfly here. We have the pipevine swallowtail here at the top right. And then below it is a species of skipper. My friend who is a butterfly biologist refers to skippers as the guinea pigs of butterflies because their faces are just a little cuter than all of the other butterflies. And so I just wanted to share that with you all. The Sonoran Desert hosts a really high diversity of skipper butterflies, which are all really hard to tell apart and all so cute. And then here's an image of butterflies puddling. So this is a behavior that happens when after rain, usually, or where there's a little bit of moisture, butterflies will congregate to basically try to get minerals out of the soil. So they're lapping up the minerals at the edges of these puddles. And this is a sight that you can see occasionally here in a good monsoon season where there's enough moisture to grow enough plants to be host plants for butterfly larvae. And then there's enough moisture to create puddles where these butterflies can congregate. And it's in this kind of environment that I really get the sense that we're in the most tropical desert, like walking through a desert landscape and coming upon a puddle and stirring up 50 to 100 butterflies. Nothing like it. And then now we're talking bee talk. So currently I work advancing the conservation of bees. So this is my special pet part of the presentation here. The Sonoran Desert has the highest documented bee diversity anywhere in the world. So we have nearly 1,000 species here. And for reference, there are 3,600 species in the US. So a quarter of all bee fauna for the US occurs here in the Sonoran Desert. And this map that I'm showing you shows relative species richness in the Western Hemisphere. So where it is darker, that means there's higher richness, and where it's more yellow, that's lower richness. So you can see right in the Four Corners region is where we have some of the darkest colors. And here's just an incredibly small selection of the amazing bee diversity we have here in the desert. I know that when I talk to many people about bees, they imagine the honeybee or maybe the bumblebee, but we truly have an incredible suite of bee characteristics, really big bees, really little bees, all different colors, all different shapes and sizes and textures. And I'm showing you a good cross section of that. So at the top left, we have the valley carpenter bee, which is one of our biggest bees. And then at the top right, we have the smallest bee known to science so far. And this is called the Euphorb fairy bee. And that bee is easily smaller than a grain of rice. The flower that it's perched upon is probably smaller than a pea. So it's a very tiny, it's like an ant or smaller. And then a couple other beautiful bees down here. We have this green halictid, and then at the bottom right, we have one of my favorites, the red-legged oil digger, which is such an interesting name. Okay, and we also have an incredible suite of mammals here, about 60 species in the Sonoran Desert. I'm highlighting just a few that you are not likely to see in where you all live. We have the white-nosed coati at the top left that is mostly has a Mesoamerican distribution and just barely makes it into the Southwest here. A lot of raccoon-like behavior for that animal, including but not limited to getting into your trash if you live in the mountains here. And then below that, we have the pronghorn antelope. And then my personal favorite on the right here, the collared peccary, known as the javelina, doing a beautiful leap for us in this image. And you can see collared peccaries or the javelinas. You can see them in the suburbs here. You can see them out in the wilderness. And one cool fact I think about them that's also kind of disgusting is that you can often smell them before you see them. They are very, very stinky. So something to keep in mind if you ever go on a desert hike. And we are privileged enough to also host in this area the federally endangered American jaguar. This is a species like some of the others that I've mentioned that has mostly a Mesoamerican distribution and just barely makes it into the US. This species used to occur in much of Arizona, and now we really only see occasionally a male moving through southern Arizona, possibly looking to expand its range or looking for a mate, but we probably don't have any resident populations. What I'm showing you here on this map, this is from the Center for Biological Diversity, and the green on this map is areas of critical habitat for the species. The black on this map, the black line is existing border wall, and the yellow are areas where the Department of Homeland Security has waived a number of environmental, cultural, and public health protection laws in order to install the border wall. So if the border wall is continuously installed along the border of Arizona and Mexico, this species will not be able to move into the US, and the US will lose any chance at hosting a population of this species that once occurred here. Another federally endangered megafauna that we have here that interacts with the border wall is the Mexican gray wolf. And so I'm showing you an image again from the Center for Biological Diversity of a radio tagged Mexican gray wolf that some lucky biologist got to name Mr. Goodbar. And its movements along southern New Mexico over the period of a couple days. I'm showing you New Mexico. It also occurs in Arizona as well. But in this image, we see that over a couple days, this wolf moved to the south, hit the border wall, and then paced back and forth along the border wall for several days before moving north. So it's possible that this wolf was looking to move south to mate with other members of its species, to explore its historic range, and was not able to. And so this is just another example of how border militarization and border wall can really impact the biodiversity that we have here. And that impact extends beyond these charismatic megafauna that I've shown you. Border wall construction and militarization also impacts waterways and the life that lives in waterways, which are super important in this really dry ecosystem. It impacts birds, bats, pollinators, plants. The construction of border wall itself causes erosion, exotic species invasion, and also uses precious groundwater in the construction. And of course, there's many more threats to this environment than just the border wall and border militarization, including climate change and pesticide exposure and habitat loss. But for the purposes of this presentation, I'm highlighting some major border impacts. So by now, I think you should have a pretty good sense of some of the biological dangers or risks in the borderlands that act on migrants moving through this area. So those include extreme heat, limited surface water available for drinking, in some cases, extreme cold. I know we have mild winters, but in the highlands, we can have really low temperatures in the winter. We have rugged terrain. I didn't really touch on this, but as you can imagine, venomous animals like rattlesnakes and scorpions. We can have flash floods and lightning in monsoon season, and then spiny vegetation. And in conditions like these, what might be a minor injury in another circumstance can become life-threatening really fast. And we see this with the ankle injury in Solito to one of the guides, where possibly that guide succumbed to his totally survivable ankle injury. But yeah, where something like a blister can cause someone to walk slower, and meaning they spend longer exposed to heat and they need more water to make it to their final destination, and they risk getting separated from their group or left behind. But we also know that biological conditions alone do not contribute to such deadly conditions for migrants. We know that indigenous people with an established culture and support here have lived in this region for thousands of years. It is also policy decisions that make migration so deadly. And so I'm going to talk about some of those for the remainder of this presentation. The primary policy choice that has contributed to such risk is prevention through deterrence. And this was a policy implemented in 1994 by US Border Patrol, which was designed to discourage undocumented migrants from attempting to cross the border near urban points of entry. And the idea was that this would funnel migrants to more remote areas where natural environment would act as a deterrent. But this strategy has completely failed. And since its implementation, 6 million people have attempted to cross the Sonoran Desert since 2000, and at least 4,500 people have died. And that is largely underestimated because it is so difficult to recover remains. Prevention through deterrence forces migrants into much more remote areas. And because of that, the distance to walk is much longer to get to a safe point. It makes it much harder to carry adequate water, possibly impossible, especially if you're pregnant or if you're traveling with a child or if you're traveling with an elder or you are an elder. This increases the danger from exposure to heat and other elements and injury. And because this desert is so remote, if something goes wrong, it is much harder to get help because there's fewer roads, there's very limited cell phone service, and there is just fewer people on the landscape. On this map, I'm showing you recovered remains of migrants since 2002. So these are considered deaths of migrants since 2002. The two different colors here just represent two different data sources. And what you see here is that in southern Arizona, I'm hovering my mouse again on Pima County here, where I live, where Tucson is a super high concentration of recovered remains. And I'm going to zoom into that in the next slide. So on this map, I'm showing you that Pima County zoom in, and I'm hovering my mouse over Tucson, where I live. And then directly south of that is Nogales, right about here. And I think that Javier Zamora probably crossed the border somewhere to the west of that in this region, kind of where the 13 is. That's just my guess based on his description of the rhino horn being visible to him. And you can see that's an area where there's a really high concentration of recovered remains, indicating to me as a humanitarian aid worker that this is a really deadly area and that it's dangerous. When migrants are forced into more remote areas, they are more vulnerable to exploitation. So it is not possible, as you saw, to cross this desert independently without the help of guides. And when migrants are forced to interact with this system of being transported that's largely owned and operated by cartel, they become more vulnerable to exploitation. And sometimes migrants can get caught in the crossfire between rival cartels in territorial disputes. And this can be true for asylum seekers pursuing legal entry as well. I'm showing you an image from an incident that happened in 2023. During this time, there was an incredibly high number of asylum seekers coming to the US-Mexico border to present for legal asylum. And at this time, on the south side of the border, so in Mexico, there was a territorial dispute between two rival cartels. And because of that, asylum seekers who are normally funneled along highways to present themselves at points of entry to enter the legal system, those migrants could not access that route anymore to a point of entry, to a port of entry. And cartels then routed them into the middle of the mountains in a really remote area and a really hard to access area. And so on a day in the winter during a rainstorm, about 400 asylum seekers arrived at the US-Mexico border wall and were noticed by some humanitarian aid volunteers working in the area. As night fell, the temperatures dropped and it started to snow. And these 400 asylum seekers who had become totally wet in their clothes and were getting colder and colder as the night wore on, there was no response from Border Patrol. So Border Patrol declined to come out to this area to transport these migrants. And what happened instead is that there was a huge response from all local humanitarian aid organizations to mobilize to this location to provide dry clothes for these people, to put them in their cars, to turn the heater on, and eventually to transport them to a Border Patrol substation to make their legal claim for asylum. And so it was humanitarian aid efforts that probably prevented a mass casualty incident on this evening. I'm going to present over the next couple of slides some statistics that come from a report called The Disappeared. This is a report that was written by la Coalición de Derechos Humanos and No More Deaths. And this report is based on observations in the field, interviews with migrants, and research on missing persons response. And so if you're interested in this, I have a link to how to get to this later in the presentation. So some of the other policy choices that cause incredible danger to migrants include this tactic by Border Patrol to scatter migrants. So chasing and scattering migrants by Border Patrol can cause injury, separation from the group or the guide, loss of supplies, and can also occasionally culminate in direct violence from apprehending agents. And we saw this in Solito with the use of helicopters, where people ran in all different directions, lost their items, lost the group, became injured. So down here, these pie charts show that on the far left, 18% of migrants that were chased reported being injured directly by the apprehending agent. 41% of them reported being injured by the terrain, and 42% reported someone in their party becoming lost as a result of chase and scatter tactics. I have a couple quotes here about this tactic. We have one from a Border Patrol agent who says, we'll let him tire himself out. If he wants to run, we'll let him run. You kind of have to pick your battles, and I usually pick the one who runs the most. We've got bodies running all over the place, and it's a never-ending game for us. And then from TJ Bonner, the former president of the National Border Patrol Council, he says, when the chase is on, you're no longer pursuing one group of 50 people. You're in all likelihood pursuing 50 groups of one person going in 50 different directions. And from Gary Thrasher, a cattle rancher in the area, says, they let them come across and chase them until they drop. That's what kills a lot of people. It's not a pleasant thing to find a corpse up there while you're ranching cattle. Another policy choice that contributes to extreme risk for migrants is this separate and unequal system to assist lost migrants. So in this area, when 911 dispatchers receive a distress call from someone they suspect to be undocumented and crossing the border, they transfer those calls to Border Patrol. And I just want to highlight how ludicrous it is for a 911 dispatcher to be put in a position of making a decision about what someone's immigration status is. And just to remind us all that there are US citizens that speak accented English and that don't speak English at all. This policy is in violation of state law and Pima County policy, but is done anyway. And when those calls are transferred to Border Patrol, approximately 70% of them are dropped due to poor cell phone reception in the area and possible issues with the infrastructure. When Border Patrol receives those calls, 40% of them result in no action at all, where Border Patrol does nothing to respond. And then 22% of them have an unclear response. So we don't know if Border Patrol responded or not. And then 37% of those result in some kind of Border Patrol search. But of those, 10% result in a death. So Border Patrol finds a migrant that's already deceased, and 17% result in a disappearance. And you can contrast that to the same region where search and rescue operations for distressed US citizens have nearly a 100% success rate. I'm going to skip this slide because I'm noticing I'm running a little short on time, but that information you can find in the reporting that I'll provide later. So there are, in response to these policy choices and the dangers of this region, there are a number of different humanitarian aid groups that operate in this area to try to end death and suffering along the border. And they do that by maintaining and responding to missing migrant hotline, by conducting search and rescues, administering first aid in the field, placing food, water, and other supplies along especially deadly corridors, providing life-saving tools to migrants in Mexico before they cross, providing aid to deportees in Mexico after they've been deported, and then documenting abuse by Border Patrol and others. And despite all of this, Border Patrol regularly impedes humanitarian efforts a couple of different ways. One of them is repeated raids of an Arizona medical aid site with no warrant. So there is a privately maintained site in southern Arizona to provide medical aid to migrants in need. These have been repeatedly raided. And additionally, Border Patrol has also been captured on film and video destroying life-saving humanitarian aid supplies. So in this case, we see punctured cans of beans, which causes the innards to spoil, and then slashed gallons of water jugs. And this is life-saving aid here. This is what people need to be able to survive. So as we wrap up, I just want to emphasize that it is both the border policy and the natural conditions together that contribute to such dangerous conditions. The policy can be changed and the natural conditions cannot. And I think sort of an unsatisfying wrap up here is that as a biologist and a humanitarian aid worker, making recommendations for policy changes is sort of out of my expertise and also out of my time window here. There are a number of great thinkers on this topic, and I'm going to recommend their work in the next couple of slides. So my next 3 slides are resources. So if you are interested in this, you could take a screenshot or take a photo. And if you miss the window, I will figure out a way to get you these. So I have some further reading recommendations for immigration policy. The last bullet point here is the abuse documentation that's hosted by No More Deaths. This is the disappeared reporting that I referenced throughout the presentation, the statistics on policy and its impacts on people. And then this slide, if you're interested in supporting humanitarian aid work along the border, this is just a tiny slice of the organizations that operate here to end death and suffering along the border. And then lastly, sorry, this is probably a little fast to snap a pic. Lastly, I have some further reading recommendations if you're interested in the Sonoran Desert biology and the natural history. And this top bullet point is a book that I truly can't recommend enough. So if this is of interest to you, please check it out. And that's the end of my presentation. Hopefully I have time for a little bit of Q&A here.
Wow, thank you so much. I'm just so impressed by how thorough this was, Saff. You just really touched on everything and tying it into Solito so nicely. I read the book in print and I listened to the audio version. And as I was reading it, I was thinking about, I was just trying to imagine this landscape in my mind. And you have just really, given us a visual for where he went, and I'm so grateful, as is our audience. So here is the first question: are there detention camps in this region, existing or planned?
Yeah, I can't speak to what's planned. That feels like a hard thing to track in this particular moment. We have a deportation center that is in Eloy, that is a long-term facility for migrants. And that's Eloy is maybe an hour north of where I live in Tucson. And then there are a number throughout the region of short-term detention. I think facilities, maybe not camps, they're not open air, although it really fluctuates. So what Border Patrol does in response to like fluctuating asylum seekers, like in the case that I showed you, that snowy picture, there was a ton of asylum seekers presenting for asylum, and those people were temporarily housed in like an outdoor yard that they then ideally, or in Border Patrol's telling, they don't spend very much time there before they're transferred to a better facility. But the slide that I skipped actually talked about apprehended people reporting inhumane conditions when they're held in short-term custody before being deported back to Mexico. So what we know is that there are a number of different like pieces of this infrastructure, and largely those are reported to have completely inhumane conditions.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So another question that we have is, because you know the desert so well, you read Solito's desert passage sections in a deeply familiar way. With that in mind, would you please share how you felt or what you thought as you read Javier's descriptions of crossing the desert?
Yeah. I cried throughout it. It like, I think imagining like his description feels so very real. I think what I heard through that portion was like really the knife's edge that those people are walking on between survival and death. Just how narrow of a window you have in order to get to where you need to go, or get to water, or get out of the elements. I think really the guide that may have succumbed to his ankle injury due to not being able to make it further, that really touched me, because it is such a real occurrence and something that I encounter out in the desert, where people have totally survivable injuries but cannot go further. It was also interesting. I spent a lot of time in this landscape as a biologist, like loving this landscape, and I think just like hearing the deep perspective of someone that is in deep struggle and in deep pain in the same landscape just was like a very jarring. It's an experience that I know well from being both a biologist and a humanitarian aid worker, but I think it really hit me over the head. And so, yeah, great question.
Well, and I shared with you before we started the event that Javier has since moved back to Tucson. He lives in Tucson, and
Yeah.
it was a long time before he was able to go back there. This is according to an interview that I watched with him, and he tried to go back, and he was there for about 4 days or so, and the trauma of being there was just so much for him that he couldn't stay. And then, but
Mhm.
after many years and working through this with a therapist that he's very open and transparent about, he said that he basically wanted to do exposure therapy, and he wanted to reclaim the landscape as his own, and to be able to go back to it and be comfortable there, and see the beauty of it, and make that his home again. So that's what he's done. So that is where he is now. I hope you get to meet him one day, now that you know
Yeah.
that you live in the same city as him. That's
Yeah. I'll be keeping my eyes peeled for
Yeah.
events.
Well, let's see. It looks like another question just came in. Javier Zamora's journey took place several decades ago. Has the number of people crossing the border decreased significantly in 2026 so far this year?
Yes. What happens with how people move changes based on policy. So a number of years ago, 2023, we had way more people presenting for asylum. So that's a lot of people arriving at the border to make a legal claim versus people like Javier moving through the desert, attempting to be undetected, to be picked up maybe 50 miles or between 10 and 50 miles from the actual border. Right now, there are no asylum seekers, as far as I know, because of policy choices that are current. And then it's a little hard to track. It seems like probably less, but it's also like the routes, like my ability to gauge that is based on seeing how supplies out in the wilderness move, like whether I go back to a site where I've dropped water and did that water stay or go? And I don't always have the answer. Like, okay, it didn't go. It's still there. Is that because there's fewer people or they're using a different route? So it's a little bit hard to answer that question, but my sense is that there are fewer people moving through the area in 2026.
Okay. And I have a question regarding the slide that you showed on the human remains that have been found.
Mm-hmm.
I noticed, and I figure this has to do with terrain, but I noticed there was one section of the larger map. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
the around number 3. Is that because of the terrain that people just don't attempt to cross there? There's kind of that gap right along the sort of on the right side at, where it says Jeff Davis and Brewster.
Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. My guess off the cuff, I could figure this out and get back to you, but my guess off the cuff is that this area might be remote on the Mexico side of the border as
Mm,
well, so it might be hard to have infrastructure to help migrants move through this area.
okay.
But I'm not totally sure. And also, something that's a factor that contributes to this data is also where are there humanitarian aid folks out in the wilderness that might even have a chance to encounter remains. So it might also be that in that Jeff Davis Brewster area that there is just less aid being administered and less people out in the wilderness there in order to detect those remains. So I don't totally know the answer to your
Okay.
question, but a
Someone is actually
couple
speculating.
hypotheses.
Someone just chimed in that that looks like it might be Big Bend National Park, potentially. Is that
Yeah,
right? Is that right there?
I
Um,
think so. Yeah.
okay. Um, well, thank you so much for this. I also want to let you know, incidentally, Javier Zamora, he's going to be in Whatcom County on March 12th and 13th. He's also on February 24th going to be he's going to be speaking in conversation with Christina Rivera Garza for Seattle Arts and Lectures, and that's in person and virtual. So if you want to see him, see a live stream, see him speak, Seattle Arts and Lectures will also be hosting him on February 24th. I'm going to put a link in the chat to our feedback form. Anyone who is still with us right now online, we would be very, very grateful if you would click through to that link and complete the form and let us know how we can improve. Let us know what we're doing right. Let us know what we can work on. We are just any feedback at all, we so appreciate. And appreciate the audience for being here tonight, but mostly Saff. Wow, thank you. This was wonderful, and fortunately, this event is recorded, so we're going to be able to put it on the Whatcom Reads website for everybody to go back and watch and share with their friends. And I'm just very grateful for all of the wealth of information you've shared with us this evening.
Yeah. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Thanks for your attention. And if anyone has a question they didn't get answered, you can feel free to contact me directly through Claire, or we'll figure a way out. But thank you so much.
Okay. Oh, and also just in the chat, I just want you to know that it's just thank you after thank you after thank you. Grateful for the work you do for conservation in that region. Um, uh, thank you. So grateful for the work you do for conservation in that region. Again, thank you for added depth to Javier's memoir. So it just goes on and on. So, all right,
Thank you all.
everybody. Thank you, Saff. Thank you, audience, and have a lovely night.
Bye bye.
Bye.